Hello, now we go live to the UN as the 77th General Assembly takes place, and Fayssal Mekdad, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Syria, addresses the Assembly. Let's listen.
Mr. Saba Kursi, President of the General Assembly, I congratulate you on your election to preside over the current session of the General Assembly. I thank your predecessor, Mr. Abdullah Shahid, for his presidency over the past session. I would also like to thank the Secretary General for his efforts during his mandate in accordance with the provisions of the UN Charter. Mr. President, today we find ourselves at a critical, dangerous point in international relations. Conflicts, wars, and threats to international peace and security are on the rise. Terrorism and chaos have been spreading. The global economy and food security are under threat. Climate change has increased. This is the result of attempts by some countries to impose their hegemony over other countries, to hoard their resources and wealth, and to implement their straitjacketed agendas by investing in terrorism and by imposing lethal weapons and putting a stranglehold on economies, completely flouting international law. There has been occupation, there have been wars, and the excuse has been to spread democracy and support human rights, and yet other states have been destroyed, innocents have been killed. What has happened in our region is just but one example. The terrorists these people support call these people the moderates who are seeking freedom, and yet these terrorists were actually tools used to destroy other countries and which are not subject to their agendas. They have called for smart sanctions, knowing that these sanctions are simply methods for collective punishment and for killings against people who are supporting their own homeland, calling for sovereignty. This is what's happened in Syria by undermining access to medication, to food, to fuel, to basic goods. The Syrian people, as I say, are just one example. Ladies and gentlemen, we see this very unfortunate situation, and yet we must take a decision. We must be responsible at this critical turning point in history so that we can ensure a better future for ourselves, but also for future generations, and to set up a multipolar world order where everyone is working under the auspices of the UN Charter, supporting its purposes and principles. In this appeal, we know what we're speaking about because the war against Syria ultimately was an attempt by the West to maintain control over the world. But this war, which aimed at breaking the will of Syria to isolate it from the world, has failed. And yet this experience has been painful for the Syrian people. For more than 10 years, the Syrian people have seen organized terrorism supported by a government everyone is familiar with. There's been illegal military interference, and we have economically been besieged, and unilateral coercive measures have been taken, ruthless measures. Mr. President, we hoped to see peace and stability in our region, but on the contrary, we've seen more Israeli practices which have pushed the region to an unprecedented level of tension and instability. There have been massacres. There's been an escalation of military aggression against the Palestinian territory and against civilians, and there have been settlement policies, Judaism policies, besiegements, arbitrary detentions, forced displacement, and racial discrimination. These Israeli practices are crimes, and it is unacceptable for these crimes to go unanswered, and those who are responsible should be held accountable. We stand by the brotherly Palestinian people as they fight to free their occupied territories and to establish their sovereign independent state throughout their territory with Jerusalem as capital, but also to guarantee the right of Palestinian refugees to return home under international law and General Assembly resolutions. We also support the Palestinian approach to become a full-fledged member in the United Nations. This is something we have looked forward to for a long time, and we hope that some members of the Security Council will not undermine these efforts. Mr. President, since the occupation of the Syrian Golan in 1967 and until today, Israel has exerted the worst serious systematic violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, including by settlements, by changing the demographic composition, by imposing Israeli nationality and ownership documents by force over the Golan population. There's also been the plundering of natural resources in the Golan, where Israel has buried nuclear waste and where Israel has taken over land to set up wind farms. All of this is well documented. Israel has added a new chapter to this dark chapter by supporting terrorist organizations, including the Al-Nusra Front and the Al-Qaeda and Daesh groups, but also through repeated aggressions against the Syrian territory. Yes, Israel has supported Daesh and the Al-Nusra Front. Israel has targeted civilian installations repeatedly and methodologically, including civilian ports. This undermines the peace and security in the region and in the world, and it endangers the lives of civilians, but also the safety of civil aviation in the region and in the world. The Israeli leaders who have committed war crimes and crimes against humanity do not have the right to declare that they question these civilian and humanitarian rights in international courts, continuing to support and to say nothing about Israeli practices and those who claim to be the guardians of international humanitarian law and international human rights law have been accomplices in these crimes, and they show the double standards applied. Syria will exercise its legitimate right to defend its land and its people in every possible way so that the authorities of the Israeli occupation are held accountable for their crimes. The occupied Syrian Golan is in the heart of every Syrian. Our right to recover the entire Golan territory up to the 1967 border is an undying right. It is guaranteed in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions, including Security Council Resolution 487 of 1981. Ladies and gentlemen, illegal military presence on Syrian territory runs counter to international law and the UN Charter. This presence must cease immediately. Combating terrorism in all its manifestations and ultimately uprooting terrorism can only take place through cooperation and coordination with the Syrian state, respecting its sovereignty, its independence, its territorial integrity and unity. We cannot combat terrorism through international illegal coalitions which violate the sovereignty of states, which destroys villages and cities, which carries out massacres against civilians, which plunders national wealth and supports terrorists. We cannot combat terrorism by occupying other territories and applying forced displacement and changing the demographics, nor setting up so-called safe zones and working with terrorists, or by collectively punishing people by cutting water off to civilians. The separatist militants who still cherish these ideals must be aware of the reality, and they must abstain from counting on foreign support. Those who do not work with their homeland have no homeland. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, since the 2011 crisis, the Syrian state has called for national and local reconciliation, calling for a return to normal throughout Syria in order to promote national unity and consolidate cohesiveness in the Syrian society. In this way, 21 amnesty decrees have been published, particularly the Legislative Decree number 7 of 2022, decreed by President Bashar al-Assad, President of the Syrian Arab Republic, an amnesty for terrorist crimes committed by Syrians, with the exception of crimes which have led to deaths. This amnesty is particularly important because of its legal, political, and social nature. It is an effort by the Syrian state to ensure national reconciliation, to have a social agreement, and to ensure lasting stability. Syrians will continue their efforts through this approach. It has been effective on the ground, and it has enabled the return of many Syrians to a normal life alongside all other Syrians. Despite these difficult circumstances which Syria has known, my country has honored constitutional deadlines. A few days ago, and before coming to New York, we held democratic elections for local councils with 59,000 candidates. Which shows and reflects great popular participation and support for democracy and decentralization in every region and government, in every city and town. Mr. President, Syria has welcomed efforts and initiatives under the political process, and in this regard, Syria reiterates its support for the meetings which are being held under the Astana Agreement. We also welcome the results of the Tehran summit held on the 19th of July 2022. And during that summit, we declared the attachment, the commitment to Syria's territorial integrity and the rejection of separatist plans supported by terrorist groups. However, all of this will remain dead letter if Turkey continues not to respect these results, and even the results of the Astana Agreement. Moreover, Syria is following with interest the work being done by the Constitutional Committee, which was set up through the Sochi National Dialogue in 2018. The Special Envoy for Syria must play the role as a facilitator for inter-Syrian dialogue in this process with Syrian ownership and in accordance with the mandate. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, surely you know that before the terrorist war, which was carried out against Syria in 2011, Syria was one of the safest, most prosperous and stablest countries in the world. We were self-sufficient and we could meet the needs of our people exceptionally in the region, be it in the area of education, health, public services, but this unique war has changed the stakes. We have seen an unbearable humanitarian crisis, and today, what was the cause of all of that? The answer is quite clear now. The primary cause is terrorism and then unilateral coercive measures imposed by Western states and the plundering of the wealth of the Syrian people. One example is that according to estimates, the direct and indirect losses in the oil sector, gas sector in Syria since 2011 reaches up to 2022 has reached 107 billion American dollars. Let me repeat that, 107 billion American dollars. We are seeking compensation for those damages. In this world, we must have a world of peace and security, and not a world for monsters or of monsters. The Syrian state, Mr. President, is doing everything possible to manage the humanitarian situation on the ground, to rebuild what terrorism has destroyed, and to ensure the return of Syrian refugees. And we offer facilities to support humanitarian aid provision to by the United Nations as quickly as possible in accordance with Security Council Resolution 2642. We estimate, despite all of our reservations, that these resolutions may be an additional step towards improving the humanitarian situation in Syria and to bolster the access to basic services. However, this will depend on the implementation by Western states of the provisions of the resolution, in particular increasing humanitarian aid and quick reaction projects for water, for sanitation, for housing, education. With the previous resolution, 2585, the implementation of these projects can only happen if the Western states continue to wish to support development in Syria, and not if they continue to set up hindrances and obstacles, including through unilateral coercive measures or so-called economic sanctions. Mr. President, Syria reiterates its position on the special Russian military operation in Ukraine and the right of Russia to defend itself and to secure its national territory. We are convinced that the Russian Federation is defending not only itself, but justice and the rights of humanity, the rights of everyone to reject unipolar hegemony. We support the return to the nuclear agreement for Iran, which the United States illegally withdrew from unilaterally. We also support the constructive approach adopted by Iran on this matter. And we call upon the Western authorities to satisfy the legitimate requests of Iran. We continue to support the principle of a united China and support China's position with regard to foreign interference in its domestic affairs in Taiwan, Hong Kong, or Xinjiang. We insist on the inalienable right of China to take necessary measures to defend its sovereignty, in particular with regard to the unprecedented escalation and the policy of provocation carried out by the United States of America. My country condemns the embargo against Cuba, which has gone on for decades, including the bill on trade with the enemy. I don't know whether or not the Cuban or the Syrian people or the Russian people, I don't know why that law was promulgated. But we also call for an end to the American military maneuvers on the Korean Peninsula, which has exacerbated tensions. We also call for a lifting of all unilateral coercive measures imposed by the West on Russia, Iran, Venezuela, Belarus, Nicaragua, the DPRK, Zimbabwe, Eritrea, everywhere in the world, including my country, Syria. This is economic terrorism, and in its brutal nature, it is equal to armed terrorism, either legally or in terms of the inhumane consequences on our people. We call for an end to the attempts to become involved in the internal affairs of these countries and to respect their sovereignty in accordance with international law and the UN Charter. Mr. President, in conclusion, our world has known exceptional circumstances in the past few years. There have been considerable challenges in terms of politics, economics, health, climate change as well. Today, we are seeing tensions and an escalation internationally of those tensions and threats. The world is headed into the unknown if we do not meet these challenges together, if we do not respond to the aspirations of our people, and if we cannot ensure security and stability, prosperity and sustainable development everywhere. The purpose of leaving no one behind should not be an empty slogan. We are convinced that in order to meet all of these goals, we must ensure first that some Western states understand that the true great powers are not powerful because of their military, but because they respect international charters and because humanity prevails over selfishness, over colonization. And once these countries have truly understood that we are living in the same world where the interests and securities of all countries depend on the interests of other countries. Thank you.
I thank the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates.
We were watching live the statements of Fayssal Mekdad, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Syria. Mekdad